Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Fire These Times. My name is Ayman Makarem, and I'll be your host for today. Joining me are two Sudanese commentators, Raga Makawi and Dalia Muhammad. In this episode, we'll be talking about what is happening in Sudan, the current war situation, as well as the revolutionary movements which it has effectively crushed. We'll talk about Sudan's recent history, the political discourses both locally and internationally, and touch on the wider implications at the regional and global level for what we're witnessing in Sudan today. But first, I'd like to ask our guests to introduce themselves in whatever way they see fit.
Hello, Ayman. Thank you for having me on your podcast. This is really exciting. So my name is Raga Makawi. I am Sudanese British. I'm based in London, and I work as a researcher at the London School of Economics. Yeah.
Hi, Ayman. Thank you for having me as well. I'm Dalia Abdelmoniem. I'm Sudanese, and prior to the war, I was a small business owner, and that's now in the ashes. And I've kind of stumbled into a new like vocational job, which is more like of an analyst and a commentator on Sudanese politics and African politics in general. So this is where I am at the moment. I'm currently in Cairo, and happy to be here with Raja, and let's see where this goes.
All right, thank you both for those lovely introductions. So I think it'd be good to start with a brief overview of what's happening today, as in the war, how it started, who are the key players, and what are the impacts of people on the ground.
Okay, I'll jump in on this one. I mean, I think we're 6 months since the war started, and my answer is pretty much the same every time I'm asked, what's the situation like in Sudan? There's not much change. If anything, it's gotten worse. The humanitarian situation is dire. It's getting worse and worse. There's no sign of let up between the fighting between both generals, the Sudanese army and the RSF, the paramilitary group headed by General Hemeti. And the international community seems to have taken a step back, not really interested or not really don't have much of a say anymore in what's happening. And we're basically, I think we're just biding our time to see what happens next. It's very disheartening because the destruction of the country continues. I mean, I can handle the looting of the homes, and I can handle war, but the idea of the destruction of the production sector of the country, the economic factor, the infrastructure, hospitals, schools, this is what matters to me, because I don't know how we're going to be able to rebuild, if we're ever able to rebuild. Because already Sudan, before the war, we were in a really bad, one of the poorest countries in the world. We tick all the boxes when it comes to countries that are considered to be somewhat of a failure. And this war has just exacerbated the situation for us. And so I watch and I read and I see what's happening. And every time there's a little spark of hope that maybe something's going to happen, it seems we take a few steps back and the war just erupts even further. And right now, one of the things that's coming out is the kidnapping of Sudanese civilians by RSF. And they go through their phone book and they call their contacts and demand ransom. And you're talking amounts of $1 million, $1.5 million. And this is happening to a friend of mine, a friend of hers. And it's just, the horror stories keep coming out and they're getting worse and worse. And I mean, there's just no let up. We as Sudanese haven't caught a break since the highs of 2019 of the revolution to the nadir of what we're going through right now. And it's just one blow after the other. It's like you're in a ring with Mike Tyson at his peak, and there's nothing you can do. The blows just keep coming, and we're being hit from everywhere. And it's just really, it's taking a toll on all of us, those who are still there, those who've managed to leave, and those who were always out but don't know what to do. It's depressing, to be honest. I don't know if Rajat definitely has something to add to this.
Thank you so much, Dalia. I mean, the way that you described the blows, it's so poignant. yes, we're up against an opponent that we have no way of, hitting back or even defending ourselves. And I mean, I don't know about you or the rest of the people who have been affected by it. I am down. I've been down for a long time and I can't take any more blows, but they just keep coming. Maybe this is something that we could also kind of touch upon later in this episode, the mental kind of cost or the mental health toll that's affecting an entire community. I mean, yes, of course, we have to think about rebuilding the economy, rebuilding the country, but how about rebuilding also our psyche as a community? What does it mean to be a Sudanese after all of this is done and dusted? But to go back to Ayman's question about how this war came about, I think this has been in the books for a long time. The ultra militarization of Sudan's both polity and economy, and they both feed each other. And this seems to be an expected ending to how different parties, both domestic, regional, and international, have been at a tug and at each other's throats to kind of land themselves a bit of the pie, a bit of power at any cost. And this is not new. I mean, obviously, what's happened in Khartoum is the latest. But this militarization of entire communities and societies for the benefit of certain elites and their polities who are ready to cut whatever deals and basically do whatever in order to kind of edge an inch closer to power. Darfur has more than 20 years of heightened militarization that was a product of first the state arming certain groups against each other, and it was a fight over resources, over land, reworked land relations for the benefits of certain groups or certain elites. And obviously in response to that, then you had rebel groups emerge over 20 years, and then as a result, you had an entire generation of young people who had not, received ample education, who were never able to enter the job market properly, and have, as a result, sought, violence or the barrel of the gun as the only means to be able to make a living. And this has extended until it's reached, its ultimate conclusion, which is the seat of power.
No, yeah, thank you both for the sharing your insights. I think there's something very strange about the development. It's something very relatable for me, coming from Lebanon, where we did have this kind of amazing, elated high, 2019 as well. And ever since then has just been a blow after blow after blow after blow. And it is very difficult to even have a kind of imagination left to kind of think. I wanted to go back a little bit into talking, just as an overview, before we get really into it, about the kind of the key players, the specific parties. So you mentioned Darfur, and it's very important because what used to be I've often heard this discussed in Sudanese circles as a periphery. It's called the regions. And this is a place that has experienced genocide for decades. And one of the generals today, Hemeti, came to power or rose in the ranks in the Janjaweed in Darfur. And then in many ways, that violence that was kind of experimented and developed over there then came to a seat of power in Khartoum. And so how does that come about? What is the sort of specific history between Hemeti and Burhan that resulted in essentially this violence we're seeing today?
Well, I think one of the common factors between Burhan and Hemeti is the role of the Islamists, the Kazan. Don't forget, Hemeti rose to power in a way. He was like the private army of the former president, Omar al-Bashir. He utilized Hemeti and his men as a way to protect him. And Burhan also has a history of violence in Darfur. I think one of the first conflicts arose was in Jabal Marra, and he was the general in charge. So there is that common factor. They both have blood on their hands. It's not one or the other. They're in my book, in regards to what their actions are towards Sudan and Sudanese. There's not, maybe one is more legitimate than the other because he's the head of the national army, so to speak. But in my book, they're both pretty much the same because both of them have wreaked havoc, have caused war, destruction on Sudanese, regardless of where you are in the country. And I think they were bedfellows when it suited them. And then once they yanked that power, and reached that high level, that high pedestal, it became a conflict between who's going to have what. And this is what we're paying the price for, basically, two men fighting over the megalomania, who's going to be in power, like Raja said. And, it's funny hearing all of Burhan's statements, and I keep thinking, you shook hands with him, and you committed that coup in October 2021. So at one point in time, he was your BFF, and now all of a sudden, and he's listing all these, what do you call it, that the RSF has committed, the atrocities that RSF have committed, and I'm like, yeah, you can list the same thing for the army, but everyone has, a convenient amnesia when they want it. So they've forgotten all the past 30, 40 years of conflict and just focusing on the past 5 months. But if you look at our history of Sudan, it's always been, ever since we've gained independence, there's always been conflict or war or something. It's never been peaceful or, let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya. That's never happened, except for maybe 2 years during Nimeri's time. So it's, if you've read up on Sudan and you followed on Sudan, it's not a surprise at all what's happening right now. It was inevitable. There was no way two generals, two separate armies were going to coexist peacefully together, no matter how much, outside actors, regional actors tried to push for that to happen, even local, even our own politicians, even no matter how hard they tried to push them together, you can't put a square peg, round hole, so to speak. It had to happen. And, it was, I think we all knew this was going to happen, that this was going to be the end result. Well, but for me personally, I didn't think it was going to happen so quickly, so soon. I honestly thought there's going to be a little more like, of a duel going on between them before things flare up. But they didn't even go through. They didn't even go through the preliminary rounds. They just went straight, head-to-head clash. And I keep thinking what can happen or what can be done to somewhat end this conflict. And I keep drawing blanks. I keep trying to think, okay, maybe this. And I think even if outside actors, yank the strings and like pull them and tell them to pull back or to hold back, I think we've gone too far down the line for anything to happen. I think it's just going to be one long-winded conflict. And for me personally, I don't see how or when it can end. But it's a natural progression of the past few years in Sudan, especially since 2013, when the government first put down protests and democracy, calling civilians and since then it's just been a slow transition into this full-out war that we're having right now.
Yeah, I agree completely with everything that Dalia said. Perhaps just going back to the point that you raised, Ayman, at the beginning about this concept of the periphery. I think historically in Sudan, the people of the center, the urbanites like ourselves, have always thought of the periphery as something that is maybe removed from our own realities. We had a very kind of, contentious and contested relationship with it. And it kind of, oscillates between us, vying to defend them or defend it, whatever, we imagine it is, as we did during the early days of the revolution, all of the country is Darfur when we proclaimed that. And between, kind of blaming them, using the ethnic card to subdivisions and say things like, well, people in Darfur are nothing like us, or these people, their tribal systems are the main reason why we can develop a society. So I think that we as a political society, at some point, perhaps post-war, need to address this. We need to address the periphery question in a more rigorous way, if we are even to develop a proper, kind of civic project, which we have failed to do in these last 4 years during the revolution. I think, if anything, this war has proven that the periphery is and always was the locus of Sudanese politics, right? We tend to always think that it's the state that sits in the center with all its professionals and civil servants and political elites who have the upper hand in deciding what happens, where, and how. But the reality is much more complicated than that. And if we were to talk about the ominous relationship between Burhan and Hemeti, it was actually it flourished within the context of the periphery, the periphery as an area that's, contested, removed, that's a battleground. And the facilitator of this, egregious relationship was the army, or the security sector, the security arena with all its players, the army, the military intelligence, the security apparatus, in all its forms. That's where, as Dalia said, these two struck a relationship and became, BFFs. The kind of common ground that they were able to achieve and realize, and then build on to transfer their power to the seat of, to the center, developed, in the periphery.
I just want to add something. Yeah, when you were talking about post-war and how we need to address those in the center will address the periphery, I think it's broken. I think this war has really shown the ugly side of the Sudanese society in regards to how we view each other. It's already, you see all these caricatures and all these jokes being made of, of Hemeti, and, but I keep telling people, Hemeti is a product of the center. Hemeti was not conjured up by some genie in a bottle. Hemeti was made by the center because he was a useful tool for their demands. And now that creation has come to bite all of us in the behind. It's not just the people of Darfur who were suffering, round two of Hemeti and his actions. It's actually now the rest of the country. But we need to address how we, those in the center, continue to view the rest of the country. Yes, we're made up of so many different ethnic groups and tribes and dialects and backgrounds and all of that. And some people see it as a point of weakness that Sudan can't move forward because of that, hybrid mix of people. But for me, and I think for many of us, especially of our age group, we see it as a strong point. But unfortunately, that strong point isn't being translated when it comes to the time of being seated at the table and discussing it. Even after the revolution, after the coup, they were still being marginalized. The people at the table were still the same old political dinosaurs who've always been there since the day I was born. There's been no change. So even with, outside actors and regional players and organizations, they kept to the same old traditions of keeping those who have been affected the worst and, affected the worst by the actions by the state and by actors of the state, and by those who can see and say, no, you need to include all of us. This pie needs to be shared equally by all of us, not just shared 80% by so-and-so, and then we give the crumbs to the remainder of the country. I am from the center. I am from Khartoum, but when we were leaving Khartoum to go to Port Sudan, I was shocked at how infrastructurally and everything behind the rest of the country was. And I'm just talking about an hour out of Khartoum. I'm not even talking about going into the depths of the country. It's just an hour just going into Medani, a Jazeera state. So, and I was thinking that, and I was like, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not surprised that this is happening because for so long, people have been, people came to Khartoum, the state of Khartoum, because there was nowhere else to go. Because where they were, there was nothing. They literally had nothing. They still have nothing. And we kept at it. We kept hammering it into them that Khartoum is special, Khartoum, Khartoum. And so will our politicians or will the negotiators or the mediators realize that you can't have talks, you can't have roundtable discussions if you don't include every single person who's affected? And at this moment in time, the ones who are affected by this war are the people of Darfur. The sheer number of Darfurians escaping beats out the number of people from Khartoum who left via Egypt, Ethiopia, and Saudi Arabia, for example, or the UAE. It's just, so that alone says it all, but no one's paying attention to that. Darfur is still being used as, oh, Darfur, poor Darfur. No, it's not just poor Darfurians. It's how do you make sure that we keep saying never again. It's being repeated so many times, this phrase, for so many events. And yet these same events keep being repeated time and time again. It's like we never learn. And yes, during the revolution, we're like, yes, we're all Darfur. But now hear what they're saying about the RSF. There's a very derogatory term they use to describe people from Western Sudan. They call them gharaba, which literally means from the West, but the connotations is quite horrible. They're like, yes, the RSF is all gharaba. They're all, they're not Sudanese. Usulum from Chad, their origins are Chadian. So already that conversation is being had and it's being repeated a lot. So I would like to think that we will have this discussion post-war, but honestly, I don't think we will. I think if anything, we're going to double down and it's going to become even worse. And remember, like we used to say, oh, this person is a cause, keep away from them, they're Islamists. The conversation will be, this person is da'ama. Whether they are or they aren't, we're just going to align them to that group of RSF soldiers. And let's not forget, the vast majority of these RSF soldiers are kids who know nothing, who've basically been told, here's some money, just take a gun and go fight. And my sister keeps repeating this, and I have to agree with her. The RSF is a creation of our politics, our policies, us. They didn't come out of nowhere. They emerged from within us. Just like the Islamists emerged from within us, just like, there's no outside factor here. We're all Sudanese, but the lines of division have been drawn. And I think it's when and if this war ever ends, it's going to get uglier. It's going to become really ugly. And we're going to see a horrible side to us as Sudanese. And we've always, prided ourselves in our being open and welcoming and so on. We're welcoming to others, but we're not welcoming for ourselves.
I mean, fascism in Sudan is on the rise. You've got a particular kind of populism that has emerged, especially, in the last 2-3 months. I see it everywhere on social media. People make proclamations, ethnic proclamations, about certain groups and certain people in sweeping blanket terms. There is no sense of, the danger that this could pose, even if the war ended tomorrow, especially in a society as, kind of fragilely knit as the Sudanese one, with all its kind of, historic problems, basically. And I'm sorry to say that the majority of these narratives are emerging from people like us. And it's disheartening, because we're talking about educated middle class who have gone into reaction mode full on. I understand they're angry, they're scared, they are grieving the loss of everything, but, turning your worst on, communities that have at some point or other, and even now, in the long problematic history of Sudan, being at the receiving end of state and structural violence is not the answer. But yes, a very kind of concerning form of populism is on the rise in Sudan.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack there. And I want to jump in and say that there's honestly so many similarities. And I feel in so many of the discussions of the center and the periphery, and the rise of populism that is sort of focused on marginalized communities, but ultimately their victims will be everybody. And I see this so much in Lebanon, wherein now there is so much antagonism. And yes, coming from people like me, and middle class and educated, against Syrian refugees, who people constitute as an other. And that, again, everything is so much has collapsed in Lebanon. And so we are in a situation of complete economic and political and social collapse. But this has nothing to do with the Syrian refugee. And what really scares me, obviously for the well-being of the Syrians in Lebanon, but is that these things that are mobilized against these peripheralized people, marginalized people, is ultimately going to embolden forces that we then can't stop. And we see that just yesterday, there was this tiny protest for people protesting for freedom of expression that were violently attacked by a kind of coalition of sectarian gangs, essentially. And when I mean coalition, I mean the whole sectarian makeup. And so there's this really powerful quote for me that I think about by Angela Davis that pertains to this. I think it goes like, if they come for me in the morning, they'll come for you in the night. And to me, this is the imperative of listening to marginalized communities, and not in a virtue signaling way, but in a way because it pertains to all of us. And I think there's one expression of this that came out of Sudan that I thought was really incredible, which is in the form of the resistance committees during the revolution. Because if I'm not mistaken, the first resistance committees to form politically were in areas that are considered the regions. And in their makeup and in the ways that they discussed with each other, and then through the political charters that they all wrote together, it was an attempt to combine these 18 different states and sort of trying to erase this false dichotomy. Well, not false dichotomy, but this forced dichotomy of center and periphery. And so I wonder if you could speak towards that, because I think definitely coming from Lebanon, there was a lot of people who looked towards the freedom of the forces of freedom and change as a kind of model, but completely ignoring the resistance committees that kind of formed the actual grassroots. So if we could go back and talk a little bit about this, I think that's a really interesting dynamic.
I think the resistance committees was a natural progression of the social fabric of what made Sudan, because when you have let's say when you have someone who's sick, you're not the only one who takes care, or you're not the only one who steps in to help. The whole neighborhood, your friends, your family continue. So I think the resistance committees, it was something similar. They took that idea of like, okay, we all help each other because the state provided nothing, did not help at all. So people had to help and provide for themselves. So if you couldn't do it, someone else would step in and help you out, you know? So I think the resistance committees was a natural progression of that. They just took it on a more, structured manner, and they really thought about it and how they can actually implement this, not just on a social level, but also on a political and state level. And it worked. It's working until now. I mean, in communities in Khartoum and Darfur, where aid agencies cannot reach or cannot get through, they are the ones who are providing the medical help, the logistical help, the financial help. They're holding, food banks and communal food planning to help everyone out. It just goes to show that when you take away all the politics out of things, people can actually be more effective, be more proactive, and actually help each other. But what's sad is that for so long, the resistance committees were pushed to the side. They were heralded as being too young, too naive, too idealistic. It's not going to work out. We know better. I remember hearing that phrase about, they don't know much. They don't have the experience. But in reality, they do have the experience because they grew up getting nothing from no one. So they had to band together to really help. So they just put that on a more larger, wider scale. And it's disheartening that until today, even with all that's happening, the resistance committees are still not being treated as an equal partner, or being given that seat at the table. And then you get all this whole, social media rumorville, so to speak, telling you, oh, this group sold out and they've joined with this political party, or this group is, doing this. But they're still doing their job. They're still in Khartoum, they're still in Umbetta, they're still in all those neighborhoods, and they're just continuously doing their job. But they need their position, their status needs to be elevated. It needs to be elevated by those who can, but they're not doing it. And I say, just talking from in terms of our Sudanese political groups, they're completely ignoring them. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see them being involved. Like, they're going on their African and European tours. Where's the resistance committees? They're doing the job that you, as politicians, failed to do. But they're not being heralded. They're not being given that seat at the table. But if you talk to any Sudanese, average Sudanese civilian, they all recognize what they've done and what they continue to do. And if there is one glimmer of hope, it's those resistance committees. As to what they've done, they've shown that there's no need for these divisions, these lines that we continuously draw and say, this is where you are, and this is where I am, this is where the rest of us are. They've blurred those lines. But will they be taken more seriously? They should. The NGOs are taking them seriously. They're using them to make sure that their aid gets through. But the powers that be continue to ignore them, continue to push them to the side. And that's what's frustrating to me about our political leaders. So, leaders, quote unquote, because I don't think they're leaders anymore, but that's what they are. That's what I'll label them as. So, but yeah, I think for me, that's one beacon of hope for me. It's the resistance committees, that they've continued doing the job. Even they've been beaten, they've been arrested, they've been tortured, they've been detained, they've gone through the whole gamut of abuse by state and state actors, and yet they continue to stand their ground and do their thing. And they've never budged, they've never swerved away from their mandate, and that is just something that it should be heralded more, and it should be studied more, I think, because it is something that I think other communities and other communities can learn from, especially in countries where there is a lot of the ethnic divisions, there is a lot of conflict, political divisions, and so on.
Well, maybe just to add to what Dalia said is, obviously I say this while holding the RCs, to the, utmost and highest. I have the utmost and highest respect for them. I see them as the future. They are the one glimpse of hope in an otherwise, dark reality. And I'm just wondering, how useful is it for a political model like that of the RCs to be brought to the, within the realm of the state, right? How useful is it to bring them, into the fold of power? Will it just corrupt them? Will it create divisions between members of the same committees, or across the board, across all their geographical locations? Because the reality is, we're dealing with a social movement with particular structures that are not equal but highly combined. If you take the resistant committees in Khartoum state, for example, or in Khartoum, the capital, Khartoum, the city. In Khartoum, like every post-colonial city, is an urban enclave that is divided by class, ethnicity, gender, and other things. These variables speak to power politics, and I've done a little bit of research on the kind of constituency of the RCs and the materials that they've produced, and I've noticed that there was a lot of internal contestation, not competition but contestation, even regarding realizing or kind of rallying around certain political positions. And there's no problem with that, right? If we're debating politics, positionality is key, and people have a right to, communicate political positions from their own point of view, or as it affects them. But that didn't preclude the fact that there were, uneven hierarchies that affected how the social movement was able to organize, to be productive, to communicate, to represent itself. And it did create, divisions from within, and did affect not just the outcome, which were the charters, but also the process and the timeline. And these are really important things that we need to talk about moving forward. I believe that the resisting committees could end up, are actually now, have managed to form a locus of, a political vision, and most importantly, education through experience, through doing. No one is telling them. They've gone through a lot of, trial and error for the last 5 years, and they've paid with it for their lives. And this is why I always say, whenever I sit down to talk about the RCs, I say that these people, if I'm going to describe them as something, even if they're 15 years old, is that they are political adults. They are more politically mature than the most senior politician in the freedom and change forces, because they have, faced the brunt of violence on the street, violence that came from militias, from the police, from the state, from the army, right? But also from these hierarchies, and they have preserved, they have prevailed, they have continued, they've not quit. But for us to say that the political project or the political vision that they have is, complete, or has even materialized, might be, jumping the gun. And I don't know if I need to say anything about the forces of freedom and change. I mean, honestly, that name does not suit them at all. They have nothing to do. They are neither a force, nor are they about freedom or change. But I have to say that if one looks at the long history of, political evolution and rupture, at the different political junctures in Sudan since independence, we have had these junctures, these turns, these revolutionary turns every 20 years. And we have had almost identical elite-led political committees that have emerged as, leadership figures at the helm of every revolution. And every time they have proclaimed certain political values, progressive, democratic, liberal values. However, their actions, and more importantly, their history in relation to the political establishment, has been quite problematic. The forces of freedom and change have come out of another body that was created during the signing of the CPA. Do you remember the name, Dalia? What was it called?
Okay, it's Sudan al-Jadid
Born or something. There's so many names, there's so many committees, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I remember. Oh my God, yeah, but see, it was Sudan something.
But the reason you don't remember, and I don't remember, is because there's so many of them. It's ridiculous. But this is also a political tactic. Every time, right, they want to show themselves, show their reputation, right, immerse themselves forcefully and illegally into a new political project, they just kind of rehuddle and rename themselves.
Yeah, I call them political dinosaurs. I mean, they've literally been there since the day I was born. Same faces, same names. Some have passed away. The majority are still there. And for some reason, they have very long lives, mashallah. But see, just to go back to your points about the RC and being part of the political process, unfortunately, if they continue to be on the grassroots level, in terms of Sudanese population at large, they won't be seen nor viewed as an entity that needs to be acknowledged. They will give them the pat on the head and tell them, "One good job, thank you," but that's it. And I also think the reason why, yes, they have their problems, their disagreements, their disputes, and that's part and parcel of the nature of the monster, so to speak. But the reason why I have such faith in the RCs is simply because they represent a demographic that has been hit the worst. They're the ones who are like the youth. They're that age bracket between the ages of 15 and I think, let's say 45, who haven't seen anything from the state or from this country or in anything positive. They've had it the worst, and they're not disillusioned. They have an idea. Maybe they're a bit too idealistic, but they've never wavered from what they believed in. I mean, after the coup, I was going out week in, week out to all the protests. They never changed their tune. Sitting and talking to them, they never changed. They believe in what their call is for. And to me, that says a lot, because they could have easily been paid off. Some have been paid off of probably, but they want something better for themselves. They want something better for their community, for their country, for their people. And they're not so, how do you say it, hardened by the reality, the political reality that many of us see, that they haven't become, so they still believe that there's a chance, for democracy, for human rights and liberty, and it's so on and so forth. And it's kind of, for me, it fills me, it's good to see that, because politics is a horrible monster. It can eat you up and chew you out, and you get nothing out of it. But they're sticking to their guns. I mean, a lot of the RC members never left Sudan. They're still there doing what they signed up for, and that to me says a lot, that even through all the crap that's happening right now, maybe their mantra has switched slightly, as in, let's save the country, let's try to help the people that we can, but they're holding on to their beliefs and to their, oh God, I've lost all my English now, but you know what I mean. So I hear you about what you say about the RCs, but after all, the past few years have shown anything to me, they've stuck to their guns. They've never wavered. They've called out those who sold them out, or they've always been there. And we think we all need that one little thing we can hold on to, say, well, this is the future for us. This is how we can move on. We can move forward from this quagmire that we're in. Let's just hope that they don't get disillusioned by the realpolitik that they will unfortunately, inevitably as well face. Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah. And if anything, they are at a monumental juncture right now, with Burhan and the army, opening doors for popular recruitment, the kind of, so-and-so-called conscription. Most of the people who have remained in Sudan, the youth serving age, were probably at some point in the last 4 or 5 years either directly members of the RCs or at least involved in the protesting and the revolution. So now, bless them, they are, being faced with, a monumental kind of, decision. They have to make the choice of defending their homes, their lives, their lands, from the incursion of, fighters like the RSF, but also at the same time balance the short and long-term politics in relation to what it means to be a recruit in the army, right? To have to carry a weapon and point it against another member of, Sudan's extended community. And obviously, these are questions that will come back post-war as it relates to, kind of Mamdani's whole, what's it called? Killers and survivors, victims and survivors, that whole kind of concept. So, yeah.
I want to briefly, because I do see there's an overemphasis on geopolitics and talking about the international players or regional players. But specifically here, I've heard, I believe in a brief lecture you'd given, Raja, on the political economy of the Janjaweed, what are now the RSF. And one thing that I didn't know is that a lot of these young soldiers were basically mobilized in Yemen. There is also a very strong attachment to, especially for the RSF, to the UAE, who are believed are the predominant buyers of Sudanese gold, which brings in the question of the sort of material reality that a lot of people are facing. I definitely know this. Again, I'll bring in my example of Lebanon, wherein the army, especially after the war, really recruits more from peripheral areas, from the north or the south. And so there's this material dilemma. There's this very real problem wherein people have all industries have been destroyed, and there is not much in the way that the entire country is a kind of market-based neoliberal economy, that there really is not much options to sustain oneself. So could you speak to that a bit more, just in terms of the kind of the macro that is reflected in the micro?
I mean, yes, it's exactly what you just said, that I think this has to do with the history of post-colonialism, which was meant to be developmentalist. Sudan's earlier relation with the Gulf was one of developmental loans for agriculture investment. And now we're talking about the era of the 60s, the 70s, and obviously all these kind of, massive extended developmental projects failed to yield the kind of, economic turnaround for the country, but also profits on the global economy. But since then, the nature of financial flows, financial transactions, is between countries of the global south have become somewhat more ominous. Bashir's 20 or 30 years of power has been shored up mostly through what we call political funding from, the Gulf. So in order to maintain his, control, mainly, especially over urban constituencies, the state has to subsidize a lot of the public services it provides. And that obviously kind of, weighs heavily on the economy, especially one that is not productive. What usually happens is that countries, this is not unique to Sudan, it happens, in all of the countries of the global south. What happens is countries then turn to international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and they ask for loans. But obviously these loans are attached to a set of conditionalities. One of them, and the most important one of them, is that you cannot use this money to continue to subsidize wheat or medicine or whatever, for the public, and that you have to, push some austerity measures and force the public to, find other means basically of, procuring life-saving needs. So what Bashir does, or what the Gulf has kind of, developed into some sort of kind of, regional geopolitical technique, is that they bail these countries out with political funds. So they send them kind of, some lump, kind of, unconditioned, without any conditionalities, no strings attached, kind of, sums of money to kind of, revive the economy. But obviously all these funds are kind of, this revival process is short-lived. And so what happens is the economy obviously is in a nosedive. You receive the political funds, it goes up a little bit, and then it goes down quickly after that. However, there are costs to these political funds. And in the case of the Emirates and Saudi, it was the involvement of, RSF fighters from the Periphery in the Yemen war. Soon after that, it became a matter of, extending kind of, really problematic kind of investment agreements over huge swaths of land in Sudan for the use of these same countries. And shortly after that, it then became the ports. So it's almost kind of, an extended incursion over, literally and physically over Sudan's, economy. First, it was labor, even if it was fighting labor, and then it's land, and then later it's ports, and so on and so forth. So it's a particular kind of political economy that is, in a sense, connected to, or kind of, share characteristics of a war economy that has kind of developed as part of the parcel and package of, these regional geopolitics. And obviously with the RSF, it's quite extreme, because not only are you exporting violence, you also have to contend with the fact that when these war ends, or when these funds to finance these young men end, these men come back with, a taste of a lot of dollars, a lot of money, but also with one skill, and that's wielding the gun. And I think that's what happened in the case of Sudan. You had, thousands and thousands and thousands of war-trained young men who were still in their prime, and who were still looking for, a source of income. And the only thing they knew what to do was fight or wield the gun. But also Sudan's kind of, domestic politics kind of complicates things, because the long history of Sudan's internal wars also mean that you've had not militias necessarily, but kind of, rebel movements with a political cause who have kind of emerged over different periods, but also kind of died down or kind of dissipated because there was no outcome for their mobilization. And they also left behind thousands and thousands of young men who were ready to be absorbed into whatever fighting force would pay them the highest. So you ended creating some sort of kind of, this is what I talked about earlier, you end up kind of, militarizing, people at the community level. And all for the cost of, a house or a car or the ability to, to wed. Marriage is a big thing, especially in the periphery, right? It's the transference, it's a transition from being, child to an adult, regardless of age. And a lot of men, in order to achieve this status of adulthood, would, normalize employment in, under these kind of conditions, in these circumstances, for the sake of, bringing back some money to their family, to their mothers, marrying, and so on and so forth. So it's complicated. It's not just regional kind of, politics kind of driven by the incursions of, an extractive capitalist system, but it's also domestic politics that is kind of, open to receiving such kind of influences.
Yeah, I just want to add something to what Raja was saying. It's very interesting because it's a different way of looking at things than I have looked at it. But I think also resources plays a big part in terms, especially in the likes of the countries of the Gulf. Yes, they've built like these modern Meccas, maybe Mecca is the wrong word, modern Las Vegas styles, cities, but they still suffer from resources. And a country like Sudan, with its myriad of problems and issues, it's just, resources-wise, it's an endless pot, whether it's agriculture, whether it's access to the Red Sea, whether it's the Nile waters, whether it's the minerals, the gold, the petrol, you list them, Sudan has it. So I can see it's like a prized asset to have, and doesn't matter how the means justify the end, so to speak. So whether they're supporting the RSF, whether they're supporting the SAF, whether they're supporting some unknown, rebel group that we even haven't heard of yet, but they're creating, they will do that if it means that they can guarantee for themselves access to resources that they, in their wildest dreams, would not have access to. And it's not just them. It's not just the Gulf countries. There's other countries, nations involved, You have leadership that really doesn't care about what they sell off or what they give out, as long as they can maintain that seat of power, which is why the role of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and even Iran is so big in countries like Sudan and Libya and Syria and Yemen. And it will continue to do so as long as we have leadership that really has no problems in selling us out for the highest bidder. It comes down to that, basically. It's resources, it's geopolitics, it's the flexing of political muscle and political economical muscle. And as always, it's the people who end up paying the hefty price. Where's Bashir now? Bashir started Bashir and his cronies started this whole let's sell off Sudan to the highest bidder. Where are they now? They've created this mess. They've gotten away scot-free, so to speak. And we're still here discussing the mess they've created and trying to think of ways to clean up this mess. And every time we make an attempt to clean it up, something happens and the mess gets worse and gets bigger. And we have to rethink, replan, go back to square one and think of what can we do. And unfortunately as well, there's no one out there who actually wants to help. And when I say help, I don't mean in terms of giving aid or giving loans or whatever. It's just helping, as in just giving the guidance to be able to move forward. No one does that. No one has offered anything. Everything that's been put on the table, it's for someone's benefit, but nothing for us as Sudanese, for example. And it's disheartening to see, and it's disheartening to realize this is happening. And at the same time, I also look at our own people, our own leadership, whether it's political or businessmen, or people who've had a part to play, and instead of choosing the best part for Sudan, they chose the supporting part for themselves, and left us just sitting there twiddling our thumbs, not knowing what we can do.
You hit on a really important point, which I think is something that unifies so many contexts within the global South, which is this complete lack of internationalism and this incredible need for internationalism. So I think what Sudan has definitely taught us, and Syria as well, is that this myth of the international community is a myth, that there's a lot of talk, and even when there is aid, that they talk to specific people, but they ignore even more, and that they're really either unable or unwilling to actually assist in progressing our revolutionary demands, which are not just idealistic, but necessary for our survival. And when I think about what is missing and what that's lacking, is that it's not grounded in a real kind of revolutionary internationalism, which I have no idea how it forms, but I've definitely seen the ways that it doesn't work, or that it's sort of lacking, especially in the case of Syria, for example, which I do want to ask about in terms of Sudan, because there's this Syria over the last decade has gotten a lot of international attention, but in many ways that was really harmful, because with a lot of these people who hypothetically could be international comrades, ended up being some of the most toxic, some of the most harmful. Here I'm thinking about what are called the alt imperialists, tankies, if you will, people in the West who see Bashar al-Assad as an anti-imperialist figure, and so ridiculously and then all these conspiracy theories and everything. So it's almost like a double-edged sword, and so I've noticed in Sudan, for example, that there isn't that same international reach. In some ways that's good, in some ways that's bad. I wanted to see if you had any thoughts or opinions on that.
I actually think there's conflict fatigue, so to speak. In a way, it's just like donor fatigue. There's conflict fatigue and also at the same time, I don't think people know how to box Sudan. Are they an Arab country? Are they East African? What are they? Are they African? Are they Christian? Are they Muslim? They can't seem to box. People like to put things in certain boxes, like, so Syria is this, and Palestine is this issue, and so they don't know where to put Sudan. And so in a way, it's kind of like, okay, maybe if we ignore it for a while, it will just go away. But to ignore it is to your own detriment, I think. And I think this is one of the questions I've been asked when I've done job interviews. Why should we care about Sudan? And I'm like, because what happens here doesn't just affect me, or it affects my northern neighbors. It affects literally this whole region. If you look at the whole Sahel, from the Atlantic coast down to the Red Sea, it's just one long line of coups, and and all these like different hands, tentacles of outside players having a say in what's happening. And it's the same thing in Syria. There was a lot of discourse, because I was following up on the Syria case, because I went to Syria like a year before the war broke out. So it broke my heart to see what was happening. But it was just amazing how the narrative was switched and played to suit certain actors. It played into their hands. Like, I mean, even the White Helmets, that group, the White Helmets, were so bad-mouthed, so politicized, that you couldn't even mention their name without being attacked, as in how could you, and so on and so forth. We had people disputing the fact that there was chemical weapons were being used in Syria. people actually went against and said, no, this is not happening. They would make you out to be a liar if you said so. That discourse, that change of narrative hasn't happened to Sudan internationally because we're doing it ourselves as Sudanese. We really don't need outside help. Just leave us to our own devices and we will mess it up the way whatever way we can. But I honestly think it goes back to fatigue, this whole, and also in regards to Syria captivated the attention for so long, but then something else came along, and that was Ukraine. You're talking about blonde, white, blue-eyed people who look like you and me, and they were invaded by big old bad Russia, and so that's completely taken over the whole international political arena. And just look at, one simple example, look at how much aid donations were given to Ukraine and how much is being given to Sudan, for example. Look at how Western governments treated Ukrainians, who left and fled Ukraine for safety, and how it's not just Sudanese, but how Ethiopians, how Sudanese, how Syrians are treated when they're attempting to flee for their own safety. We may not have an outside country invading our country, that's true, but still, it's war, it's conflict. You seek safety. So it's, I think, a lot of factors come into play, and it's funny how Bashar was taken from being like this horrible, dictator, to now being welcomed back with open arms by the Arab League, by all other regional actors. It's like nothing's ever happened. It's like these past 10 years do not count. It's just like people have selective amnesia. They really only remember what they want to remember and forget what they want to forget. And it's disgusting, actually, how he's been embraced back and welcomed back. And Syrians are still, the war hasn't stopped, the destruction hasn't stopped. And Syrians are still, refugees, millions of them outside their own country. They still can't go home. It's just a sad state of affairs, but this is the reality we're all living in right now, Like I was telling people, I don't say no to any media requests simply because we have to, as Sudanese, no one's going to speak for us. We have to speak for ourselves. You can count how many Sudanese experts, Western Sudanese experts, there are on one hand, so to speak. So we have to do it ourselves. We have to gain back control of our own narrative, make sure that our story is being told, that we have a say in what's being put out there and what's being reported, and how to make sure that attention doesn't, move away. It has moved away from Sudan, but whatever little snippet we can get, I personally think we should take it and run with it, because we have no other choice.
Thank you, Dalia. I just going back to the term you used, Ayman, what was it? Ultra anti-imperialism, was it?
Alt-imperialism.
Alt-imperialism. Okay. Well, the truth is it does exist in Sudan. It's just the terms of it are a bit different, right? It's kind of tailored to context. I mean, think of someone like Hamdouk, for example, right? Who was the head of the transitional government. He was kind of vetted by, members of the international, not just community, but also, kind of members of, high-standing governments with a lot of weight. He was, until the end, and even now, he remains the darling of the international community or the West. No one can say anything about him, right? There's no fault. I'm sorry, they can't fault him. And consider what Hamdouk represents. Hamdouk represents a kind of order that befits the West's understanding of what lacks on the global side, in the global South, and particularly in the African continent. That he has come to kind of, bring order, or to dispel disorder, right? To kind of reform the state, so to say, right? Kind of remove politics from it, remove patrimonialism from it. He came to, kind of fix the civil service. He came to fix the economy, right? He came to sign peace deals, right? And obviously at the helm of all these ideas around what ailed Sudan was the need to kind of shore up a faltering economy. So this is the logic, right, of new colonialism, which is an economic logic, right? It's a logic of state functionalism. So just tailored to the particularities of Sudan, the same kind of, ideas or the reactionarism that you saw in other contexts like Syria or other places does exist in Sudan. But in the case of Sudan, it was kind of, designed or kind of communicated in the language of professionalism. I mean, I guess there's an idea in, amongst the international community as well that maybe Sudan's failure to shore up itself is a product of, its own kind of internal ailments. And obviously this also builds on a long and problematic history of, kind of masked up racism that is, kind of inbuilt into kind of, long-standing colonial relations and a history that continues to kind of reproduce itself, where the West presents the African continent with a formula of how it's meant to develop and become civilized. And if it doesn't meet, these standards, then, it's just the way we are. Even if tried and tested, it doesn't work. And then this kind of lends on to the other point I was going to talk about, which is kind of the external interventions, not just of government and institutions, but of individuals in the name of expertise, So the crisis of the experts. And this has been going on, with Sudan, not just since the war started, but since the revolution started, right? I mean, Sudan was the latest kid on the block, with some refreshing news. And, suddenly we had, this barrage of experts, all who could, comment on, the state of Sudan and the status of the revolution and what these people want and what they don't want and how it should be and how it shouldn't be. And it's a money-making scheme. Some of it, yes, kind of is controlled by the, institutional standards of what's, good and rigorous academic analysis is. Others, equally published still, is quite atrocious. And the ethnic kind of, narrative is quite strong throughout. And these problematic accounts or analyses remain dominant. They come from the outside, they're catered to an international readership, and they have nothing to do with the Sudanese people. And yes, and that's why I say kudos, Dalia, when Sudanese people are asked to make a media presence, they should always jump at the opportunity, because I think one of Sudan's many problems is that historically, we always had people speaking for us.
Well, thank you so much. I think we have to wrap up, and I think that's a really great note to end on. Thank you both so much for being here today and sharing your analyses and your ideas and your thoughts. There's one thing that I'm very sorry I forgot to mention, and it's usually a bit of a we at the end of every episode of Fire These Times, we ask the guests for recommendations for books, for viewings, for anything. It could be in terms of things you would want other people to read about Sudan. And this is definitely going back to what you had said earlier, Raja, about the fact that there isn't that much text. I mean, there are texts, but I think when I was doing my research, there aren't many books book length that goes through. I think one of the best ones was the one that you had edited, The Unfinished Democracy. So on that point, if each one of you could suggest any readings or podcasts or films, now's the time.
Okay, well, very quickly, I am going to say that because we are at a moment of ideological crisis, and obviously I am directing this at maybe young people, young active revolutionary people who are members of the left everywhere, and especially members of the RCs. is to go back and read the material that was written about Sudan in the 50s and the 60s. Because back then, it was, the frameworks of the methodology of analysis was historical materialism. It wasn't, like the liberal description of political science that we see today. And particularly one book, which is called The Economy of Sudan, or Sudan's Economy, by O'Brien, is an ample text. I mean, it's a bit old, it might be out of print, but it could be sourced. And the reason I love this book is because it tells the middle class, it tells the Sudanese middle class how they are firsthand involved in kind of, shoring up the problematic behavior of the Sudanese state through economic policies, through social policies, through political policies. It kind of, looks at this history of this merchant class, which is my class, probably your class as well, Dalia, and how they have historically kind of, formed alliance with the army to create the Sudanese state and continue to push policies that benefit their particular class over everyone else. So, yeah.
Actually, I would tell anyone, go listen to Sudanese music, whether it's old or new, classic or new, modern, it's basically the music of the streets. There's so many new rappers coming out, new singers and artists. I think the cultural aspect of Sudan is what's really telling our story, because it's coming directly from the horse's mouth, so to speak. There's loads of Sudanese documentaries out. There's loads of films out made by Sudanese with Sudanese, and the music scene is amazing. I mean, I learn a lot, about the youth culture by listening to this music, even though it's not my favorite genre of music. But I can send you a list of artists and documentaries and films that are out, and like Talking to Trees and Beats of the Antonov are really good films and documentaries to see. There's also Goodbye Julia, which has just been put forward to the Oscar. It's won so many awards. And You Will Die at 20. So many films that talk about the culture, the politics, the economy, the history of Sudan, and who we are as Sudanese, because it's very unique to us, our music sounds and our films and our dialect as well. So many dialects we have. So that's my recommendation. Keep away from the books, stick to the music, blast it on, dance your ass off, and just learn something, because I think that's the best. That's what I'm doing, because I'm missing home so much. I'm just listening to Sudanese music day in, day out. My mother plays the nationalistic songs of Muhammad Wardi and all those people, and I play the youth, the Sudanese who are living abroad or whatever. And I think that's the best thing people can do.
All right, great. Well, thank you both so much for being here today. And I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Fire These Times. If you'd like to support us, head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to get early access to episodes, exclusive premium episodes, as well as access to our monthly hangout, book club, merchandise, and more. So, Raja and Dalia, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us, Ayman.